Two fake cops slammed me against my car screaming, "You're under arrest," while the whole neighborhood watched my public humiliation. Sergeant Mitchell and his partner read Miranda rights completely wrong as their HOA queen boss smiled from across the street. Handcuffs clicked toward my wrists. Everyone stared like I was some common criminal being dragged away from my own home. But these weekend warriors just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The badge hidden in my jacket doesn't just prove they're frauds. It has the authority to end them. Who's really in charge here? And hit like, subscribe if you'd like to help the channel grow. That little thanks button down below means a lot. I'd been away on federal business for 6 months, expecting nothing more dramatic than an overgrown lawn when I returned home. Instead, 2 men in dark uniforms stepped out from behind the Henderson's hedge, blocking my path to the front door. The taller one had a buzz cut and an oversized gut that strained against his polyester uniform. His partner was leaner, with the kind of nervous energy that screamed amateur hour. "I'm Sergeant Mitchell," the big one announced, his voice carrying that artificial authority you hear from shopping mall rent-a-cops. "This is Detective Lawson. You're under arrest for criminal trespassing on private HOA property." His badge caught the late afternoon sun sitting crooked on his chest, like a participation trophy. Everything about their presentation screamed fake, from Lawson's incorrectly positioned holster to Mitchell's wrinkled uniform that looked like it came from a costume shop. They forced me against my Honda Civic's hood while my neighbors emerged from their houses like prairie dogs sensing drama. Mrs. Chen from next door stood on her porch with her arms crossed, while old man Rodriguez walked his dog slower than usual, clearly eavesdropping. The whole street became an audience for what these clowns thought was going to be my humiliation. "You have the right to remain silent." Lawson began fumbling through Miranda rights like a high school student giving a book report. "Anything you say will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to, legal representation if you can't afford it." He paused, clearly lost. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you by the state." I stayed completely calm, which seemed to unnerve them more than any resistance would have. My eyes automatically cataloged every detail that proved these weren't real officers. Mitchell's gun sat too high in a holster that wasn't properly secured. Lawson's handcuffs were the cheap kind you'd find at a novelty store. Most telling of all, neither wore proper duty belts or carried the standard equipment that actual law enforcement would have. "What academy did you boys train at?" I asked casually, my voice steady despite having my face pressed against my car's warm metal. The question hit them like a slap. Mitchell's eye twitched while Lawson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Also, could I see your badge numbers? It's standard procedure for any arrest." Before they could stumble through an answer, the real power behind this circus made her entrance. Victoria Blackwell strode across the yard like she owned not just her property, but the entire neighborhood. Mid-50s, with perfectly styled silver hair and a business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Her smile was colder than a January morning in Minnesota. "Officers, excellent response time," she said, her voice dripping with false authority. "I called about this trespassing situation exactly 12 minutes ago." She gestured toward me like I was a piece of trash that had blown onto her pristine sidewalk. "This individual has violated numerous HOA regulations and refused to comply with our community standards." I turned my head slightly to look at her, keeping my expression neutral despite the absurdity of the situation. "Ma'am, under what legal authority are your officers attempting to arrest me on my own property?" I let just enough doubt creep into my voice when I said officers, to make it clear I was questioning their legitimacy. Victoria's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. "These are licensed community safety officers with full arrest powers within our regulated subdivision. You've been reported for multiple violations, and your presence here constitutes a clear threat to neighborhood security." She spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged, never had anyone question the little kingdom she'd built. "Licensed by which agency?" I pressed, genuinely curious about how elaborate this charade was. "What's the issuing authority for community arrests?" These weren't trick questions. Any legitimate officer would know exactly which department, state agency, or federal body had given them their authority, but watching all three of them exchange nervous glances told me they'd never prepared for someone who understood how real law enforcement actually worked. Sergeant Mitchell tried to regain control by stepping closer and puffing out his chest. "Don't get smart with me, buddy. I've got 15 years of experience in law enforcement, and I don't need to justify my authority to some punk who can't follow simple rules." His hand drifted toward his weapon, which was another massive red flag, since proper protocol would never involve threatening deadly force over a simple trespassing complaint. I remained perfectly still, but my mind was already cataloging every violation of proper procedure I'd witnessed. "Easy there, Sergeant," I said calmly. "I'm just asking about your credentials and training. Any citizen has the right to verify an officer's authority before submitting to arrest." The words were perfectly reasonable, but they seemed to make Mitchell even more agitated. Detective Lawson fumbled with his handcuffs, clearly unsure of proper positioning. "Stop asking questions and cooperate," he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "We don't have to explain ourselves to suspects." The statement revealed just how little these amateurs understood about citizen rights and police accountability. As I shifted position slightly, the edge of my federal credentials became visible in my jacket pocket, just a flash of gold metal that caught the light. Mitchell's eyes locked in onto it immediately, his aggressive posture faltering for just a moment. "What's that in your pocket?" he asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. "Just identification," I replied with a slight smile that probably made them more nervous than any threat would have. "Speaking of which, Detective Lawson, you mentioned 15 years of experience, Sergeant Mitchell. Could you tell me what your department's policy number is for weapon discharge? I'm curious about the regulations you're operating under." The silence that followed was deafening. Every real law enforcement officer knows their department's basic policies by heart. Watching Mitchell and Lawson fumble for answers, while Victoria's confident expression began to crack, confirmed everything I'd suspected about their little operation. "This conversation is over," Victoria declared, stepping between her fake officers and me. "You have 24 hours to vacate this property voluntarily, or we'll return with proper warrants and additional charges." The threat might have intimidated someone else, but it just made me more interested in exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. As they walked away, Mitchell turned back once more, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Next time, show some respect when Sergeant speaks to you. Rank means something around here, and you'd better remember that." The statement was so ridiculous I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. I watched them disappear around the corner, my hand resting on the real federal credentials in my pocket. These weekend warriors had just picked a fight with someone who not only understood the difference between real and fake authority, but had the power to do something about it. The question wasn't whether they'd made a mistake. It was how spectacular their downfall was going to be when they learned exactly who they'd just tried to arrest. 6 a.m. sharp, and they were back. Heavy pounding on my front door jolted me from sleep. Through the peephole I could see Sergeant Mitchell and Detective Lawson standing on my porch like they owned the place. Mitchell held what looked like official paperwork, while Lawson kept checking his watch like they were running some kind of military operation. "Open up police business," Mitchell's voice boomed through the door, with all the authority of a man who had probably practiced that line in his bathroom mirror. I took my time getting dressed deliberately, moving slowly to see how long their patience would last. Real cops would have proper procedures for warrant service. These clowns were about to show me exactly how amateur their operation really was. When I finally opened the door, Mitchell immediately stepped forward with his chest puffed out like a rooster claiming his territory. "According to my authority as sergeant, I'm issuing a warrant to search these premises for evidence of HOA violations and potential criminal activity." He waved a document that looked like it had been printed on someone's home computer, complete with clip art that was supposed to pass for an official seal. Detective Lawson positioned himself at an angle that blocked my view of the street, clearly thinking he was executing some kind of tactical maneuver. "As detective, I'm ordering you to step aside and allow immediate access to your property. Failure to comply constitutes obstruction of justice and resistance to lawful authority." His voice carried that fake confidence of someone playing dress-up in daddy's clothes. I examined the paperwork they'd shoved at me, noting the complete absence of any real judicial signature or court seal. This warrant was signed by which judge exactly? "What's the docket number?" I asked calmly, watching their faces as they realized they hadn't thought this through. Also, what court issued this county, state, or federal jurisdiction? Mitchell's face reddened as he snatched the fake warrant back. "We don't need to explain our procedures to civilians. HOA authority supersedes regular court systems in regulated communities." The statement was so legally ridiculous that I had to fight to keep my expression neutral. "Now step aside before we add more charges to your growing list of violations." Charges filed where? I pressed, genuinely curious about how far they'd taken this fantasy. What prosecutor's office is handling the case? Which courthouse should I report to? These weren't gotcha questions. They were basic information any legitimate arrest would include. But watching them fumble for answers told me everything about their make-believe authority. Lawson tried a different approach, stepping closer in what he probably thought was an intimidating manner. "Look, smart guy, I've got 15 years of experience dealing with uncooperative suspects. You can do this easy way or hard way, but either way, we're conducting this search." His hand rested on his weapon in a gesture that was meant to look professional, but just emphasized how little training he'd actually received. I couldn't help but notice the neighbors gathering on their porches and driveways. Mrs. Chen stood in her bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, watching the show unfold. Old man Rodriguez had positioned himself behind his mailbox, pretending to check for mail, while obviously listening to every word. The whole street was getting a front row seat to this performance. 15 years, where? I asked Lawson directly, keeping my tone conversational. "What department? What's your badge number and supervising officer?" I watched his confidence evaporate as he realized these were questions any real detective should answer instantly. "Also, what's your department's policy on weapon display during civil violations?" Before Lawson could stumble through another non-answer, Victoria Blackwell appeared at the end of my driveway like she'd been waiting in the wings. Today she wore a navy blue power suit with gold buttons that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. Her expression radiated the cold satisfaction of someone watching her enemies get what they deserved. "Gentlemen, is there a problem here?" She called out, her voice carrying perfectly across the morning air. "I specifically requested that this situation be handled with appropriate authority." She walked up my driveway like she owned it, her high heels clicking against the concrete with military precision. Mitchell immediately straightened up, clearly reporting to his real boss. "Ma'am, the subject is questioning our authority and refusing to comply with lawful search procedures. He's demanding documentation that's above his clearance level." The way he deferred to Victoria made it crystal clear who was really running this operation. I accidentally called Mitchell officer instead of his precious sergeant title, and his reaction was immediate and telling. "I'm Sergeant Mitchell." He exploded, his face turning an impressive shade of red. "You will address me by my proper rank or face additional charges for disrespecting a law enforcement officer." The outburst revealed just how much his fake authority meant to his fragile ego. "My apologies, Sergeant," I said with just enough sincerity to keep them talking. "Could you explain the rank structure in your department? Do you report to a captain, lieutenant, or chief?" I was genuinely curious about how elaborate their fantasy hierarchy was, and whether they had bothered to think through the chain of command. Victoria stepped in before Mitchell could dig himself deeper. "These officers operate under special HOA jurisdiction, with powers equivalent to municipal police within our community boundaries. Your questions are irrelevant and designed to obstruct legitimate law enforcement activities." She spoke with the authority of someone who'd never been told she was wrong about anything important. I pulled out my phone ostensibly to check the time, but really to see their reaction to me potentially recording or calling someone. "I need to make a quick call about this situation," I said casually. "Some colleagues who might be interested in the jurisdictional questions we're discussing here." Lawson immediately stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon again. "No phone calls during an active investigation. Put that device away immediately." The overreaction confirmed these weren't people trained in actual law enforcement procedures where citizens have clear rights to contact attorneys or witnesses. "Colleagues in what field?" Victoria asked, her tone sharp with suspicion. For the first time since this started, I could see uncertainty creeping into her confident facade. She was beginning to realize she might not know as much about me as she thought. I smiled slightly, letting them wonder exactly what kind of experience I meant. The morning sun was getting stronger, and sweat was starting to show on Mitchell's forehead, despite the cool temperature. His uniform looked even more ridiculous in daylight, with patches that didn't match and insignia that belonged on different types of law enforcement entirely. "We don't have time for games," Mitchell declared. "Step aside now or face arrest for obstruction." But his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, replaced by the desperation of someone realizing their bluff might get called. "Arrest under whose authority?" I asked one more time, watching all three of them exchange glances that screamed amateur hour. "What jail would you transport me to? What booking procedures would you follow?" Every question I asked revealed another gap in their preparation, another hole in their elaborate pretense. As they prepared for their next move, I casually adjusted my jacket, letting them catch another glimpse of the gold medal in my pocket. This time Lawson definitely noticed it, his eyes narrowing as he tried to figure out what kind of identification would be made from that particular medal. The tension was building towards something they weren't prepared for, and I could see the first cracks appearing in their confident facade. The standoff had reached its breaking point. I decided to flip the script on their little power game. "Since we're talking about authority and credentials, how about we all put our cards on the table?" I said calmly, pulling out my phone. "I'd like to verify your badges and identification before we go any further with this situation." Mitchell's face went from confident red to nervous pale in about 2 seconds. "You don't have the right to question law enforcement credentials," he blustered, but his hand instinctively moved to cover his badge. "Sergeant doesn't answer to civilians about department matters." "Actually, every citizen has the right to verify an officer's identity during any official interaction," I replied, keeping my tone educational rather than confrontational. "It's basic accountability, so let's start with badge numbers, department of origin, and supervising officers." Lawson fumbled with his wallet, pulling out what looked like a laminated card that had obviously been made at a local print shop. "Detective Lawson badge number," he squinted at his own card, 4799, Municipal HOA Enforcement Division. The pause before he read the number told me everything I needed to know about how recently he had acquired that particular piece of fiction. I examined the credentials they reluctantly showed me, noting the cheap plastic construction and computer-printed text. "These are interesting," I said diplomatically. "What academy did you attend for your law enforcement training? What was your graduating class?" I watched Mitchell's eye twitch as he realized these weren't questions you could fake your way through. "That information is classified for security reasons," Mitchell declared, which was possibly the most ridiculous thing I'd heard yet. "Sergeant training records aren't available to unauthorized personnel." He was clearly making up policy as he went along and doing a terrible job of it. Victoria stepped closer, her designer heels clicking against my driveway. "These officers have full credentials and training appropriate to their duties within this regulated community. Your continued questioning constitutes harassment of law enforcement personnel." She spoke with the authority of someone who'd never had anyone actually check her facts. I pulled out my own phone and started taking pictures of their badges, which caused immediate panic. "What are you doing?" Lawson demanded, stepping forward aggressively. "Delete those photos immediately. That's a violation of officer privacy and security protocols." "Actually," I said, still snapping pictures, "photographing badges during official interactions is completely legal and recommended for accountability purposes." I made sure to get clear shots of the obvious fake elements, the wrong fonts, the mismatched insignia, the plastic construction that screamed amateur hour. Mitchell tried a different approach, puffing out his chest and stepping into what he probably thought was an intimidating stance. "Sergeant Mitchell, 15 years of experience trained in advanced law enforcement techniques." He rattled off his fictional resume like he'd practiced it in the mirror. I don't need to prove anything to some neighborhood troublemaker. 15 years, where specifically, I pressed. What was your first assignment? Who was your training officer? These were the kinds of details that every real cop remembered clearly, but I could see Mitchell's confidence cracking as he realized he couldn't fake specifics. Before he could stumble through another non-answer, I decided to test their actual knowledge. Detective Lawson, since you mentioned Miranda rights yesterday, could you recite the complete warning? And Sergeant Mitchell, what's the proper procedure for a warrantless search in this jurisdiction? The silence that followed was deafening. These weren't trick questions. They were basic knowledge that any real law enforcement officer would know by heart. Watching them exchange nervous glances confirmed every suspicion I developed about their credentials. We don't have to perform for your entertainment, Victoria declared, her voice sharp with growing irritation. These officers have demonstrated their authority sufficiently. Your continued demands are simply stall tactics designed to avoid accountability for your violations. I decided to push a little harder. I'm going to need to verify these credentials with your department headquarters. I announced, pulling up my contacts. What's the main number for your supervising agency? I'll just give them a quick call to confirm your current assignment status. The panic in their eyes was immediate and obvious. Lawson actually took a step backward, while Mitchell's face cycled through the several shades of red. You can't just call police departments with random inquiries, Mitchell protested. That's harassment of official agencies. Actually, most departments have public information officers specifically for citizen inquiries, I replied, enjoying watching their elaborate facades start to crumble. Transparency and accountability, you understand? I held up my phone like I was about to dial. Should just take a few minutes to verify everything. Victoria stepped between her fake officers and me, clearly realizing her little kingdom was about to face some uncomfortable scrutiny. This has gone far enough, she declared. Officers, I think we have sufficient evidence of non-cooperation to proceed with enforcement actions. That's when I decided to give them their first real hint about what they were dealing with. I pulled out my wallet, letting it fall open just enough for them to see the edge of real federal credentials. Gold medal that caught the morning sun and definitely didn't look like anything you could order online. Mitchell's eyes locked onto that flash of gold immediately. What's that? He demanded, pointing at my wallet. Are you carrying some kind of weapon or official identification? For the first time since this started, uncertainty crept into his voice. Just standard identification, I replied casually, closing my wallet before they could see the details. The kind of ID that comes with proper training and legitimate authority. I let that sink in for a moment. Speaking of which, what's your department's policy on challenging federal jurisdiction? The question hit them like a physical blow. Lawson actually stumbled backward, while Mitchell's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Victoria's perfectly composed expression finally cracked, revealing the first hint of genuine worry. Federal, she asked, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. What do you mean by federal jurisdiction? For the first time since this entire circus began, the queen bee was starting to realize she might have picked the wrong target for her little power games. I smiled, that same calm smile that had been driving them crazy since yesterday. Oh, just wondering about proper protocol when local authority encounters federal oversight. Jurisdictional courtesy, chain of command, that sort of thing. I paused, watching their growing panic. The kind of details that legitimate law enforcement officers would definitely want to get right. The morning sun was climbing higher, and sweat was now clearly visible on both fake officers' foreheads. Their elaborate charade was starting to collapse under the weight of basic questions that any real cop could answer in their sleep. But they still had no idea just how spectacular their downfall was about to become. The word federal hung in the air like a bomb nobody wanted to defuse. Lawson recovered first, trying to regain his detective swagger, but I could see the wheels spinning behind his eyes as he processed what I'd just implied. Look, whatever federal connection you think you have, it doesn't matter here, he declared, his voice pitched higher than before. I'm placing you under arrest for felony obstruction and interference with a lawful investigation. The escalation to felony charges was interesting. Clearly they thought bigger threats would make me back down. Instead, I found myself automatically cataloging every procedural violation they were committing. Felony charges require specific statutory violations, I said calmly. What's the exact code section I'm allegedly violating? What's the elements of proof for your felony obstruction charge? Mitchell stepped forward, desperate to reassert his sergeant authority. I've got 15 years of experience dealing with the smart-mouth suspects who think they know the law better than trained professionals. His voice carried across the neighborhood, ensuring everyone could hear his attempt to establish dominance. You don't get to question a sergeant's arrest decisions. 15 years, where? I pressed again, noting how he never actually answered that question. What was your most recent training certification? When did you last qualify on firearms? These weren't random questions. They were basic requirements that every legitimate officer had to maintain annually. Before Mitchell could fumble through another non-answer, I decided to test their actual tactical knowledge. Since you're making an arrest, what's the proper procedure for securing a suspect who might be armed? I asked casually. How do you establish a safe perimeter during a potentially dangerous takedown? The blank stares I received confirmed everything I suspected about their training level. Real officers would know these procedures by heart, could recite them while half asleep. These amateurs were clearly making it up as they went along. Stand at attention when a sergeant speaks to you, Mitchell barked, trying to use military bearing to mask his ignorance. The command was so ridiculous that I almost laughed, but something interesting happened instead. My body automatically responded with proper military posture, feet together, shoulders back, hands at my sides. The reaction clearly confused them. Lawson tilted his head like a curious dog, while Mitchell's aggressive expression wavered. How do you know proper attention stance? Lawson asked suspiciously. You got military background or something? I maintained the position for exactly 3 seconds before relaxing. Long enough to demonstrate that I knew the proper form, but not long enough to look like I was taking orders from them. Basic civic knowledge, I replied, but I could see them filing away the information for later consideration. Victoria had been watching this exchange with growing irritation, clearly realizing her officers weren't performing as expected. Gentlemen, perhaps we should focus on the immediate violations, rather than getting distracted by irrelevant questions. She suggested, her tone sharp with barely concealed frustration. That's when Lawson made his biggest mistake. He tried to demonstrate proper handcuff technique by grabbing my wrist, but his positioning was completely wrong. Thumb placement, incorrect angle, all wrong, leaving himself vulnerable to basic defensive moves that any real officer would never allow. Without thinking, I automatically corrected his grip. If you're going to cuff someone, your thumb goes here, I said, adjusting his hand position, and you maintain this angle to prevent resistance. The correction came from years of muscle memory, the kind of automatic response that comes from extensive training. The moment I finished speaking, I realized what I'd just revealed. All 3 of them were staring at me with new suspicion, clearly wondering how a civilian would know proper restraint techniques. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications. How do you know police restraint procedures? He demanded, stepping closer with renewed aggression. You some kind of cop groupie security guard wannabe? But there was uncertainty in his voice now, like he was starting to realize this wasn't going according to plan. I read a lot, I replied casually, but the damage was done. They'd seen enough to know I wasn't just some random homeowner they could intimidate with fake badges and borrowed authority. The question was how long it would take them to figure out exactly what they were dealing with. Lawson tried to salvage the situation by pulling out his handcuffs again, but this time he was clearly nervous about the procedure. Turn around, hands behind your back, he ordered, but his voice lacked conviction. Any resistance will result in additional charges. What's your department's policy on use of force escalation? I asked, still not moving to comply. At what point are you authorized to use physical restraints versus verbal compliance? Another basic question that any real cop could answer instantly. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Victoria's perfectly styled composure was starting to crack as she realized her officers couldn't answer basic law enforcement questions. This is ridiculous, she declared. Officers, if he won't comply voluntarily, use whatever force is necessary to secure him. That order crossed several legal lines, but it also revealed how desperate they were becoming. Interesting authorization, I noted. What's the legal liability if your officers use excessive force during an arrest? Who carries the insurance for wrongful detention lawsuits? Mitchell's face went pale as the implications hit him. He was probably just starting to realize that playing cop carried real legal consequences, especially when someone got hurt or rights got violated. We have full authority, he stammered, but his confidence was completely gone. I decided to give them one more professional hint before things went too far. You know, I said conversationally, in my experience with law enforcement interactions, the best officers always know their limits. They understand jurisdiction, proper procedure, and most importantly, I paused, letting my jacket fall open just enough to reveal another glimpse of gold metal. They know when they're dealing with someone who outranks them. The word outranks hit Mitchell like a slap. His sergeant persona crumbled as he realized someone might actually have more authority than his pretend rank. Outranks, he repeated weakly. What do you mean outranks? Victoria stepped closer, her designer heels clicking nervously against the pavement. What exactly are you implying? She asked, her voice losing its earlier commanding tone. What kind of training do you have? I smiled that same calm smile, watching all three of them try to process what they'd just heard. Good training, I replied simply. Federal training. The two words hung in the morning air like a thunderclap, and I could see the exact moment when they realized their little neighborhood power game had just encountered something much bigger than they'd bargained for. The words federal training echoed across the quiet suburban morning like a warning shot. I watched all three of them process what I'd just revealed, their expressions shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching panic. But Victoria wasn't ready to surrender her little kingdom without a fight. Federal training means nothing in this community, she declared, though her voice had lost some of its earlier steel. These officers have full authority within our jurisdiction, regardless of whatever background you claim to have. She gestured to her fake cops like they were her personal army, but I could see the cracks forming in her facade. Mitchell tried to rally, puffing out his chest one more time. That's right. Sergeant authority supersedes federal consultation, or whatever you think you are. His voice carried across the neighborhood, but now it sounded desperate rather than commanding. In this HOA, I outrank everyone except the chief. Chief of what department? I asked quietly, genuinely curious about how far their fantasy hierarchy extended. What's his name? Where's his office located? The simple questions hit them like physical blows, each one revealing another gap in their elaborate pretense. Before Mitchell could fumble through another non-answer, neighbors started gathering in earnest. Mrs. Chen had called over the elderly couple from across the street, while the family 3 houses down positioned themselves on their porch with coffee cups and cell phones. Word was spreading that something significant was happening, and everyone wanted a front row seat. Lawson noticed the growing audience and tried to use it to his advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out in his fake detective voice, we're conducting official police business. This individual is resisting arrest and obstructing justice. He gestured toward me like I was some dangerous criminal threatening community safety. The performance might have worked on people who didn't know better, but I could see several neighbors exchanging skeptical glances. These weren't tourists. They lived here, they knew what real police looked like, and these clowns weren't fooling anyone who looked closely. Detective Lawson, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Could you please state your department's full name and headquarters address? I'm sure the neighbors would appreciate knowing which agency is providing their law enforcement services. The request was perfectly reasonable, but watching Lawson's face go pale confirmed he had no good answer. Victoria stepped forward, clearly realizing her officers were failing spectacularly in front of the audience she'd wanted to impress. This has gone far enough, she announced. Officers, I want this individual arrested immediately for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest and threats against community safety personnel. The escalating charges were interesting. They were clearly hoping that bigger accusations would make their authority seem more legitimate. Instead, it just made them look more desperate. "Threats?" I asked calmly. "What specific threats have I made? Do you have them recorded?" Mitchell's face reddened as he realized they'd just added another charge they couldn't substantiate. "Your whole attitude is threatening," he declared. "Questioning sergeant authority is the same as threatening an officer." The statement was so legally ridiculous that I heard one of the neighbors actually snort with laughter. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone again, "questioning authority is a constitutional right, but since we're talking about threats, let me make a call to clarify the situation." I scrolled to a contact that would end this entire charade with a single conversation. "No phone calls," Lawson shouted, stepping forward aggressively. "Put that device away or face additional charges." His desperation was showing now, the fake confidence completely evaporated in the morning sun. I held up my hand in a peaceful gesture while keeping the phone visible. "Just calling some colleagues who specialize in jurisdictional issues. They'll be very interested in this unique interpretation of law enforcement authority." I let that sink in for a moment, especially the part about HOA officers having arrest powers. Victoria's perfectly styled composure finally cracked completely. "What colleagues?" she demanded. "What kind of work do you actually do?" For the first time since this circus began, she was asking questions instead of making proclamations. The growing crowd of neighbors had emboldened someone to speak up. An older man I didn't recognize called out from across the street, "Hey, are these guys actually real cops? Their uniforms look funny." His question voiced what everyone was thinking, but hadn't dared to say. Mitchell whirled around to face the crowd, his authority complex fully triggered. "Sergeant Mitchell, Municipal Law Enforcement," he shouted. "Anyone interfering with official business will be arrested." The threat was empty and everyone knew it, but it revealed just how far he was willing to go to maintain his fantasy. That's when I decided it was time to start ending this charade. I reached for my wallet, moving slowly and deliberately so everyone could see what was happening. "You know what, folks? I think it's time we all got some clarity about authority and jurisdiction around here." "Don't move," Lawson barked, his hand going to his weapon. "Keep your hands visible." The overreaction to me reaching for identification was another massive red flag that several neighbors clearly noticed. "Just getting my ID," I said calmly, continuing the motion, since everyone seemed so interested in credentials and authority. My wallet fell open, revealing just the edge of real federal gold that caught the morning sun like a beacon. Mitchell's eyes locked onto that flash of metal immediately. "What is that?" he demanded, pointing at my wallet. "Are you carrying some kind of badge?" His voice had gone up an octave, clearly recognizing that whatever I was holding looked nothing like the plastic toys he and Lawson carried. "Standard identification," I replied, but this time I let the wallet fall open a little further. Not enough to see the details, but enough to reveal the distinctive shape and color of legitimate federal credentials, the kind that comes with real training and actual authority. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Victoria seemed frozen, staring at the gold medal that obviously wasn't something you could order online. The crowd of neighbors had gone quiet too, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Federal?" one of the neighbors called out. "Are you saying you're federal law enforcement?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see all three of my antagonists holding their breath for the answer. I looked directly at Mitchell, then at Lawson, finally settling my gaze on Victoria. "Well," I said with that same calm smile that had been driving them crazy since yesterday, "I guess we're about to find out exactly who outranks whom in this neighborhood." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the suburban street, as everyone waited for the revelation that would change everything. But I wasn't quite ready to end their suspense yet. The moment had come. I could feel the entire neighborhood holding its breath as I slowly opened my wallet completely, letting the morning sun catch the full glory of authentic federal gold. "Special Agent Supervisor Nathan Sinclair, Federal Bureau of Investigation," I announced clearly, my voice carrying across the silent street. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Mitchell's face went from red to white, in seconds his mouth falling open like he'd been physically struck. Lawson actually stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet as the reality hit him. Both fake cops stood frozen, staring at the real federal credentials that made their plastic toys look like children's dress-up accessories. Supervisor, I repeated, letting the words sink in completely. That means I outrank not just detective and sergeant, but captain chief, and pretty much every level of local law enforcement you can imagine. I held the badge steady so everyone could see the distinctive FBI eagle, the official seal, the weight and craftsmanship that screamed legitimate authority. The crowd of neighbors erupted in whispers and gasps. Mrs. Chen actually dropped her coffee mug, the ceramic shattering on her porch steps. The elderly man who'd questioned their uniforms called out, "Holy crap, he's FBI." His voice carried the shock that everyone was feeling. Mitchell tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound. When words finally came, they were barely a whisper. "Sir, we didn't know." The transformation was complete and instant. The swagger was gone. The fake authority evaporated, replaced by the automatic deference that years of military or police training had beaten into his nervous system. Lawson's reaction was even more dramatic. His hand moved away from his weapon like it was radioactive, and he unconsciously straightened into a proper attention stance. "Supervisor Sinclair, sir," he stammered. "We weren't informed of federal presence in the area." The formal address came automatically, muscle memory kicking in despite his panic. Victoria stood frozen, her perfectly styled composure shattered like her entire world view. The woman who had been ordering around fake cops just moments ago was now faced with actual federal authority that could destroy her little kingdom with a single phone call. But they work for the HOA, she said weakly, like saying it would make it true. "Ma'am," I said politely but firmly, "these gentlemen work for nobody. They're unemployed civilians playing dress-up with fake badges and pretend authority." I gestured toward their plastic credentials. "What they've been doing is called impersonating federal officers, which carries a maximum sentence of 3 years in federal prison." The legal reality hit Mitchell like a physical blow. "Federal prison?" he repeated, his voice cracking. "But we thought it was community security." His fake sergeant persona crumbled completely as he realized the magnitude of his situation. I decided to drive the point home about hierarchy and respect. Now, when addressing a federal supervisor, proper protocol is to stand at attention until given permission to speak. I said in the calm, authoritative voice that came from 15 years of legitimate law enforcement experience. Both men immediately snapped to attention, their bodies responding to real authority in a way they'd never managed with Victoria's pretend commands. Mitchell's chest rose and fell rapidly as panic set in, while Lawson's hands trembled slightly at his sides. "Much better," I acknowledged. "Now, gentlemen, I need you to slowly remove those fake badges and place them on the ground. They're evidence in a federal investigation." My tone was professional, but left no room for argument. Mitchell's hands shook as he unpinned his plastic badge, the piece of costume jewelry that had given him so much false confidence. "Sir, please, we didn't mean any harm," he pleaded as he placed it on my driveway. "We were just trying to help with community safety." Lawson followed suit, his fake detective credentials joining Mitchell's on the concrete. "Supervisor, we were told this was legitimate security work," he said desperately. "She said we had real authority." He glanced toward Victoria, clearly hoping to shift blame to the woman who had orchestrated their charade. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, drawn by the drama, and the shocking revelation that their mysterious new neighbor was federal law enforcement. Phones were out now, recording the spectacular downfall of the HOA's fake police force. "Sir," Mitchell ventured carefully, "what happens now? Are we under arrest?" The question carried genuine terror as he realized his weekend warrior fantasy had collided with federal reality. I pulled out my own phone, scrolling to a contact that would end this entire operation. "I'm calling for backup," I announced. "Real federal agents who will properly process this situation." I hit dial and waited for the familiar voice on the other end. "This is Supervisor Sinclair," I said when the call connected, my voice carrying clearly across the silent neighborhood. "I need a team at my location for impersonating federal officers. Multiple subjects, fake credentials, possible conspiracy charges." I paused, looking directly at Victoria. "And we'll need someone from white-collar crime for the financial investigation." Victoria's face went ashen at the mention of financial crimes. "Financial investigation," she whispered. "What financial investigation?" For the first time since this whole thing started, the Queen Bee looked genuinely terrified. "Ma'am, operating fake law enforcement requires funding," I explained calmly. "Uniforms, badges, equipment, payroll for your actors here. The Bureau will be very interested in tracking those expenditures, especially if any HOA funds were misappropriated for illegal activities." The implications hit her like a sledgehammer. Not only was her fake police force about to be arrested, but her entire financial empire was about to come under federal scrutiny. The woman who had wielded absolute power over the neighborhood was suddenly facing the real possibility of federal prison. Mitchell and Lawson remained at attention, sweat now clearly visible on their foreheads despite the cool morning air. They'd gone from playing tough guys to federal suspects in the span of 5 minutes, and the reality of their situation was finally sinking in. "Backup ETA 10 minutes, I announced, closing my phone. "Gentlemen, you have the right to remain silent, and unlike yesterday's performance, I actually know how to read them correctly." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The fake cops who'd tried to arrest an FBI supervisor were about to be properly arrested by real federal agents. The neighborhood had gone completely silent, except for the sound of camera phones recording the most spectacular HOA takedown in suburban history. 10 minutes felt like an eternity as we waited for real federal agents to arrive. Mitchell and Lawson remained at attention, their fake authority completely evaporated in the face of legitimate law enforcement hierarchy. The growing crowd of neighbors watched in fascination as the HOA's reign of terror crumbled before their eyes. The first black SUV rounded the corner at exactly 10 minutes, followed by 2 more identical vehicles. Real FBI agents emerged with the kind of professional precision that made Mitchell and Lawson's amateur hour look even more pathetic. Agent Sarah Chen, my second-in-command, approached with a slight smile that told me she'd been briefing the team during their drive over. "Supervisor Sinclair," she said, formally addressing me with the proper respect that came with actual federal hierarchy. "We have warrants for the impersonation charges and authorization to seize all fake law enforcement materials." Her crisp professionalism was a stark contrast to the bumbling performance we'd endured from the fake cops. Mitchell's eyes went wide as he watched real agents take control of the scene. "Sir," he addressed me desperately, "we want to cooperate fully with federal authorities. We didn't know this was illegal." The desperation in his voice was pathetic. The man who had threatened to shoot me yesterday was now begging for mercy. "Gentlemen," Agent Chen said, approaching the 2 fake cops, "you're both under arrest for impersonating federal officers under Title 18, Section 912 of the United States Code." She began reading them, their actual Miranda rights, each word precise and legally accurate, a masterclass in how it should actually be done. Lawson's voice cracked as he tried to speak. "Agent ma'am, we were told this was legitimate community security work. We have documentation from the HOA authorizing our activities." He was desperately trying to shift blame to Victoria, who stood frozen as her entire operation collapsed around her. Victoria finally found her voice, though it lacked all of its earlier commanding authority. "This is ridiculous. They were hired as legitimate security personnel. I have every right to employ community safety officers." Her protest sounded hollow, even to her own ears, as federal agents documented the fake badges and equipment scattered across my driveway. Agent Chen turned her attention to Victoria with the kind of cold professionalism that made criminals confess just to avoid the uncomfortable silence. "Ma'am, employing individuals to impersonate federal law enforcement is conspiracy to commit a federal felony. The financial records for their compensation will be subpoenaed as evidence." The mention of financial records hit Victoria like a physical blow. "Financial records," she repeated weakly. "This was just neighborhood security. We didn't do anything federal." But her protests were interrupted by Agent Rodriguez approaching with a tablet full of preliminary evidence. "Supervisor," Agent Rodriguez reported, Initial background checks show neither subject has any legitimate law enforcement training or certification. The uniforms and badges were purchased online from costume suppliers. He held up evidence bags containing the fake credentials. Serial numbers on the badges trace back to a novelty company in Ohio. The crowd of neighbors had swelled to include nearly the entire street. Phones were recording everything as the most dramatic HOA takedown in suburban history unfolded in real time. Mrs. Chen called out from her porch, "Thank God someone finally stopped these bullies." Her sentiment was echoed by murmurs of agreement from the growing audience. Mitchell tried one last desperate plea. "Supervisor Sinclair, sir, we apologize for not recognizing your authority. If we'd known you were FBI, we never would have." His voice trailed off as he realized he was essentially confessing to the crimes he was trying to deny. "The problem isn't that you didn't recognize my authority," I replied calmly. "The problem is that you claimed authority you never had." I gestured toward the real agents processing the scene. These agents earned their badges through rigorous training, background investigations, and sworn oaths. You bought yours online and pretended to be something you're not. Agent Chen finished processing Lawson and turned to Mitchell. "Sir, you need to place your hands behind your back." The real handcuffs clicked with the solid metal sound of legitimate law enforcement equipment, not the cheap plastic of their costume accessories. "What about her?" Mitchell asked desperately, nodding toward Victoria. "She's the one who hired us. She told us we had real authority." His attempt to implicate his boss was pathetic but legally relevant. Conspiracy charges would definitely apply to the mastermind behind the operation. Victoria's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. "I didn't know it was illegal," she shrieked. "I thought HOA presidents could hire security. I was protecting our community property values." The meltdown was spectacular. The woman who had terrorized the neighborhood for years was reduced to making excuses like a caught child. Agent Rodriguez approached Victoria with his own set of handcuffs. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for conspiracy to impersonate federal officers, fraud, and civil rights violations under color of law." The charges were serious enough to put her away for decades, and everyone knew it. The two fake cops were loaded into separate vehicles, their heads hung in shame, as neighbors they'd tried to intimidate watched their perp walk. Mitchell's fake sergeant authority had been replaced by genuine federal custody, while Lawson's detective fantasy ended with real federal charges. As the vehicles pulled away, Agent Chen approached with final paperwork. "Supervisor, preliminary interviews suggest this operation has been running for over 2 years. We're looking at dozens of potential victims who were intimidated or extorted by these fake officers." The scope of their crimes was still being calculated, but it was clearly extensive. The crowd began to disperse, neighbors talking excitedly about the morning's events. Several stopped to thank me personally, expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to the HOA's reign of terror. Mrs. Chen approached with tears in her eyes, explaining how Victoria's fake cops had threatened to arrest her elderly husband for parking violations. An older gentleman I hadn't met before walked over with a firm handshake. "Agent Sinclair, I'm retired Air Force. I knew something was wrong with those uniforms from day one, but I figured it wasn't my place to question community security." He paused, looking toward the departing FBI vehicles. "Thank you for having the authority to do something about it." The irony wasn't lost on me. These amateur criminals had picked the worst possible target for their fake authority scheme. They'd tried to intimidate and arrest someone whose actual job was investigating exactly the kind of crimes they were committing. It was like a burglar trying to rob a police station. As the last FBI vehicle disappeared around the corner, I stood in my driveway, surrounded by grateful neighbors and scattered evidence of the most spectacular impersonation scheme I'd ever encountered. Victoria's HOA empire had crumbled in less than 4 hours, brought down by basic questions that any legitimate officer could have answered. The morning sun was now bright and warm, casting light on a neighborhood that was finally free from fake authority and pretend police power. Real badges had triumphed over costume jewelry. Legitimate training had exposed amateur hour, and federal authority had reminded everyone exactly how hierarchy actually works. Mitchell and Lawson were facing years in federal prison for their weekend warrior fantasies, while Victoria's financial empire was about to undergo the kind of a federal audit that would uncover every penny of misappropriated HOA funds. The queen bee who'd ruled through fear and fake authority was about to learn what real consequences looked like. Justice, it seemed, had a sense of humor about people who tried to outrank those who actually outranked everyone. 3 months later, the verdicts were final. Mitchell received 18 months in federal prison for impersonating a federal officer, while Lawson got 15 months for the same charges. Their fake badges and uniforms became evidence exhibits in a case that federal prosecutors called one of the most brazen impersonation schemes they'd ever encountered. Victoria's fate was even more severe. The financial investigation revealed she'd embezzled over $200,000 from HOA funds to finance her fake police operation. Conspiracy fraud, civil rights violations, and embezzlement charges combined to earn her a 25-year federal sentence. The woman who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood with pretend authority was now learning about real authority in a federal correctional facility. The local police chief personally visited my home to apologize for not investigating the fake cops earlier. "Supervisor Sinclair," he said with genuine respect, "we received multiple complaints about those imposters, but we assumed they were legitimate HOA security. We should have verified their credentials immediately." His acknowledgement of federal hierarchy and professional courtesy was exactly how real law enforcement should interact. The neighborhood transformed completely once Victoria's reign of terror ended. Without the HOA's oppressive regulations and fake enforcement, property values actually increased as word spread about the community that had freed itself from tyranny. Neighbors organized voluntary cleanup days and social events that brought people together instead of driving them apart. Mrs. Chen stopped by regularly with homemade cookies, always addressing me as Agent Sinclair, with the kind of respect reserved for heroes. "You saved our entire neighborhood," she'd say, shaking her head at the memory of Victoria's fake police state. "We were all too scared to fight back until you showed us what real authority looks like." The retired Air Force veteran became a good friend, often sharing stories about recognizing fake authority during his military service. "The thing about real rank," he explained over coffee one morning, "is that it doesn't need to brag or threaten. It just exists quiet and confident until someone forces it to prove itself." Letters poured in from neighbors who'd been victimized by Victoria's scheme, families who'd been fined thousands of dollars for imaginary violations, elderly residents threatened with arrest for minor infractions, young parents intimidated by fake cops who had no legal authority whatsoever. The FBI's Victim Services Coordinator worked to help everyone recover both financially and emotionally. Agent Chen, now permanently assigned to supervise the ongoing investigation into HOA fraud schemes, updated me regularly on similar cases across the country. "Your situation wasn't unique," she reported. "Fake law enforcement operations are more common than people realize. The difference is that most victims don't have federal supervisors living in their neighborhoods." The costume company that sold the fake badges faced federal scrutiny for marketing law enforcement replicas without proper warnings. Their online listings now include bold disclaimers about impersonation laws and federal penalties. Mitchell and Lawson's purchases became part of a broader investigation into companies that enable fake authority schemes. Local news covered the story extensively, turning our quiet suburban street into a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny. The headline, "FBI Supervisor Takes Down Fake HOA Police," became a viral story about standing up to bullies who hide behind pretend badges and borrowed authority. 6 months after the arrests, I was promoted to Assistant Special Agent in Charge, partly due to my handling of the impersonation case. During the ceremony, my supervisor noted that sometimes the best federal investigations happen when agents are simply trying to get into their own homes after long assignments. The final irony came when Mitchell's cellmate turned out to be someone I'd arrested 5 years earlier for actual federal crimes. According to prison reports, the real criminal was not impressed with Mitchell's fake sergeant stories and made sure he understood exactly where pretend authority ranks in the federal prison hierarchy. Standing in my driveway on a quiet Sunday morning, I watched neighbors walking their dogs and children playing in yards that were no longer subject to Victoria's ridiculous regulations. The street looked exactly the same as when I'd first returned home, but everything had changed. Fear had been replaced by freedom, fake authority by legitimate community cooperation. Real badges protect people from criminals and pretenders. Fake badges protect nothing but fragile egos and criminal enterprises. Victoria, Mitchell, and Lawson learned that lesson the hard way, spending years in federal custody contemplating the difference between actual authority and elaborate costume parties. The HOA building sold for pennies on the dollar, its new owners converting it into a community center where neighbors gathered voluntarily instead of being summoned by fake cops with plastic badges. Leave a comment, hit like, subscribed, and if you'd like to help the channel grow, that little thanks button down below means a lot.